Good morning, children. Welcome back to this class of English, where we'll today study about the chapter The Enemy. I have already explained you this in my first part of the video, little bit introduction. Now let's discuss this chapter word by word, line by line, and paragraph by paragraph, so that there is no confusion. So, children, it's the time of World War, and an American prisoner of war was carried to the seashore, and he was in a dying state. And he was found at the doorsteps of a Japanese doctor. So, should the doctor save him because he's a doctor, or he should hand him over to the army as a patriot or nationalist? This is a very difficult question to answer. What to do? Children, it's a very thought provoking story which highlights how a doctor's duty as a trained medical practitioner towards a patient makes him rise above narrow national prejudices. Prejudice, I think I've already discussed in the first video word, it means forming an opinion about someone without actually knowing him. He risks his honor, position, and life as well, because Dr. Sadao could be killed, imprisoned, or put to be hanged. So he put his life in danger, as well as his wife and children, by sheltering a prisoner of war or the enemy. Actually, the conflict in doctor's mind as a private individual and a citizen with a sense of national loyalty is being portrayed. Means how the struggle which goes inside the person who is a citizen, as well as a father, as well as a husband, and overall, above all, a human being, and especially a doctor. So, children, let's begin with the story. Let me read the lines. Dr. Sadao Hoki's house was built on a spot of the Japanese coast where, as a little boy, he had often played. The low square stone house was set upon rocks well above a narrow beach that was outlined with bent pines. As a boy, Sadao had climbed the pines, supporting himself on his bare feet, as he had seen men do in the South Seas when they climbed for coconuts. His father had taken him often to the islands of those seas, and never had he failed to say to the little brave boy at his side, "Those islands yonder." Yonder means over there. Those islands yonder. Children, yonder means over there. They are stepping stones to the future of Japan. Where shall we step from them? Sadao had asked seriously. So, the scene of action, or the place where the action takes place, is a spot on the Japanese coast where Dr. Sadao's house was a low, square, stone built house. It was set upon rocks above a narrow beach, outlined by bent pines. Sadao's father was highly concerned about his son's education, and he talked like this, that those islands are the stepping stones to the future of Japan. And as Sadao was a young boy, he could not understand. So he said, "From where we will step from there?" So it was a funny question. "Who knows?" his father had answered. "Who can limit our future? It depends on what we make it." So father again molded the answer, and he said, "Who knows? From where we will step from there? Maybe future is the limit." Sadao had taken this into his mind as he did everything his father said, his father who never joked or played with him, but who spent infinite pains upon him, who was his only son. Sadao knew that his education was his father's chief concern. For this reason, he had been sent at 22 to America to learn all that he could be learned of surgery and medicine. He had come back at 30, and before his father died, he had seen Sadao become famous not only as a surgeon but as a scientist because he was perfecting a discovery which would render wounds entirely clean. He had not been sent abroad with the troops. Also, he knew that there was some little slight danger that the old general might need an operation for a condition for which he was now being treated medically. And for this possibility, Sadao was being kept in Japan. So, Sadao was a nice doctor, but who was behind him? That is, his father. So, Sadao's father sent him to America at the age of 22 to learn all that he could about surgery and medicine. So, he returned back at the age of 30 and he became famous surgeon. Not only surgeon, a scientist also, because he was perfecting a discovery which would make wounds entirely clean. So he became a scientist also. He was not sent to abroad with the troops, with the Japanese army, because the old Japanese general was under medical treatment and he might need some kind of operation. So Dr. Sadao was in Japan. Clouds were rising from the ocean now. The unexpected warmth of the past few days had at night drawn heavy fog from the cold waves. Sadao watched mists hide outlines of a little island near the shore and then come creeping up the beach below the house, wreathing around the pines. In a few minutes, fog would be wrapped about the house, too. Then he would go into the room where Hannah, his wife, would be waiting for him with his two children. The children, here a figure of speech has been used, that is imagery. You can see mists, fog, wreathing around the pines, beach below the house. Actually, these words make a picture in our brain. So, here a poetic device, imagery has been used. The author has used imagery. So, Sadao watched mists. Mist means fog, it which hide outlines of a little island near the shore. So, near the shore there was a little island, and it used to remain hidden. The Sadao had not been. It came creeping up the beach below his house. Then the fog would move below his house. His wife Hannah came out and put her hand on his arm. So, Hannah was his wife and he had two children. At this moment, the door opened and Hannah looked out. A dark blue woolen haori over her kimono. So, kimono and haori are Japanese dresses. So, she came affectionately and put her arms through his as he stood, smiled, and said nothing. He had met Hannah in America, but he had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. His father would never have received her unless she had put pure in her race. He wondered often whom he would have married if he had not met Hannah, and by what luck he had found her in the most casual way, by chance, literally, at an American professor's house. The professor and his wife had been kind people, anxious to do something for their foreign students, and the students, though bored, had accepted this kindness. Sadao had often told Hannah how nearly he had not gone to Professor Harley's house that night. The children, that the same moment the door opened, and then came out Hannah, and with caress she put her arms around him and she smiled. Actually, Sadao had met Hannah in America, but she did not. He did not carry his relationship until he was sure that Hannah was Japanese. Actually, Hannah met Sadao at an American professor's house, and American professor was very kind to the foreign students, and the students, though bored, had accepted this kindness. Although the American professor was a bit bored, but he was so kind that the, the students, they sidelined his boringness but accepted him that he is a nice professor. So Hannah, Sadao had often told Hannah how nearly he had not gone to Professor Harley's house that night. The rooms were so small, the food so bad, the professor's wife so voluble. But he had gone, and there he had found Hannah, a new student. So the professor whom we are talking about here is Professor Harley. So he tells Hannah that the food was so bad, Professor wife was so voluble. But actually he had found Hannah there. He didn't want to go to Harley's house. Now he felt her hand on his arm, and he was aware of the pleasure it gave him, even though they had been married years enough to have the two children. For they had not married heedlessly in America. They had finished their work at school and had come to Japan, and when his father had seen her, the marriage had been arranged in the old Japanese way. Although Sadao and Hannah had talked everything ever beforehand, they were perfectly happy. She laid her cheeks against her arms. So Hannah and Sadao, they knew each other from Dr. or Professor Harley's house, but they did not marry in America. They completed their studies there, came back to Japan, and with the consent of their father or parents, they got married. And now they were happy couple. It was at this moment when Dr. Sadao and Hannah were thinking about their past. They were reminiscing. Reminiscing means thinking about the past. It was at this moment that both of them saw something black come out of the mists. It was a man. He was flung up out of the ocean. Flung? It seemed to his feet by a breaker. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, his arms above his head. Then he curled mists, hid him again. So though both of them were reminiscing about their past, how they met, how they got into relationship with each other, then they finished their studies, came back to Japan and married, and now they are happy couple. Suddenly they saw something black come out of the mists, and actually it was a man. He staggered a few steps. Staggered means not able to move perfectly. So he came up by a breaker. Actually, breaker here means a large sea wave. So don't confuse, breaker is something else, but it means a sea wave. So his body came out of the mist. And then he curled mists, hid him again. So he got hidden again in the mist. Who is that? Hannah cried. She dropped Sadao's arm and they both leaned over the railings of the veranda. Now they saw him again. The man was on his hands and knees, crawling. Then they saw him fall on his face and lie there. A fisherman, perhaps, Sadao said, washed from his boat. He ran quickly down the steps and behind him. So suddenly the Hannah cried, "Who is that?" And Sadao got anxious and he ran from there to find out who is that man. But he said maybe a fisherman. They thought him to be a fisherman who had been washed from his boat. Hannah came, her white sleeves flying, a mile or two away on either side. There were fishing villages, but here was only the bare and lonely coast, dangerous with rocks. The surf beyond the beach was spiked with rocks. Somehow the man had managed to come through them. He must be badly torn. They saw when they came towards him that indeed it was so. The sand on one side of him had already a stain of red soaking through. He is wounded, Sadao exclaimed. He made haste to the man, who lay motionless, his face in the sand, an old cap stuck to his head, soaked with sea water. He was in wet rags or garments. Sadao stopped, Hannah at his side, and turned the man's head. They saw the face. So when they came towards him, they saw that he was a wounded man and he was lying motionless. They saw his face. Hannah whispered, a white man? Sadao began to search for the wound. Blood flowed freshly at his touch. So the man was bleeding heavily. And in order to stanch the fearful bleeding, he pecked the wound with the sea moss. So, yes, it was a white man. The wet cap fell away, and there was his wet yellow hair long, as though for many weeks it had not been cut, and upon his young and tortured face was a rough yellow beard. He was unconscious and knew nothing that they did for him. Now Sadar remembered the wound, and with his expert fingers he began to search for it. Blood flowed freshly at his torch. On the right side of his lower back, Sadao saw that one wound had been reopened. The flesh was blackened with powder. Sometimes, not many days ago, the man had been shot and had not been tended. It was a bad chance that the rock had struck the wound. So that injured man was a foreigner, and he had been carried to the seashore. Actually, that side of the shore had steep rocks. Although fishermen were there, but they were not near to that area of the beach. When Sadao checked the wound, it had fresh blood flow, and the flesh was blackened at that place due to gunpowder. Oh, how he is bleeding, Hannah whispered, again in a solemn voice. The mist screened them now completely, and this time of the day no one came by. The fishermen had gone home, and even the chance beachcombers would have considered the day at an end. What shall we do with this man? Sadao muttered with his trained hands, seemed of their own will to be doing what they could do, stanch the fearful bleeding. So, Hannah also noticed that the man was bleeding. And Sadao said, what shall we do with this man? Because by now they had coined out that he was enemy soldier who had come there. So in the meantime, Sadao just checked the wound and filled it with the sea moss. Moss, in Hindi children we say kai, green colored kai. So to stop the bleeding, he just packed the wound with moss. The man moaned with pain in his stupor, but he did not awaken. The best thing that we could do would be to put him back in the sea, Sadao said, answering himself. Now that the bleeding was stopped for the moment, he stood up and dusted the sand from his hands. Yes, undoubtedly, that would be best, Hannah said steadily. But she continued to stare down at motionless man. If we sheltered a white man in our house, we should be arrested, and if we turned him over as a prisoner, he would certainly die, Sadao said. The kindest thing would be to put him back into the sea, Hannah said, but neither of them moved. They were staring with a curious repulsion upon the inert figure. Now, children, here came the dwindling situation. They had found out that he was a white man, enemy soldier. Now, the war was going on between Japan and America, the World War. And sheltering an enemy, it means you are not a nationalist, and then you would be put behind the bars and hanged also. So Sadao said that Let's put us this soldier back into the water. And Hannah said the same thing. But neither of them moved. They were staring but could do nothing. Sadao explained that it was a difficult situation. If they sheltered a white man in their house, they would be arrested. And if they turned him over as a prisoner, he would die. They were staring upon the inert figure with a curious repulsion. So they were indecisive. What to do? Is if they will shelter him, they will be put behind bars. And if they throw him back into the water again, then this prisoner would die. What is he? Hannah whispered. There is something about him that looks American, Sadao said. He took up the battered cap. Yes, they are almost gone, was a faint lettering. A sailor, he said, from an American warship. He spelled it out, US Navy. The man was a prisoner of war. He has escaped. Hannah cried softly, and that is why he is wounded. In the back, Sadao agreed. They hesitated, looking at each other. Then Hannah said, with resolution, Come, are we able to put him back into the sea? If I am able, are you? Sadao asked. So Hannah again said, when they recognized him as an American prisoner of war who had run away, and that's why he has got the bullet at his back. So Hannah said to Sadao, Yes, what are we doing with this man? Let's put him back into the water. Sadao replied, If I am able, are you? He asked to Hannah. No, Hannah said. But if you can do it alone. Sadao hesitated again. The strange thing is, he said, that if the man were whole, I could turn him over to the police without any difficulty. I care nothing for him. He is my enemy. All Americans are my enemy. And he is only a common fellow. You see how foolish his face is. But since he is wounded, you also cannot throw him back to the sea, Hannah said. But there is only one thing to do. We must carry him into the house. But the servants, Sadao inquired. Children, actually, the Sadao tried to satisfy his nationalist nationalist being, by saying to himself, Oh, you see how full is the face of this soldier? How dirty he is? But his doctor part also came up. And he said, But since he is wounded. So Hannah said, Okay, then what can we do? We cannot throw him back to the ocean. So Hannah said, Then we must carry him to the house. So thou inquired, What about the servants? What we will say to them? We must simply tell them that we intend to give him to the police. As indeed we must. Sadao, we must think of the children and their position. It would endanger all of us if we did not give this man over a prisoner of war. Certainly, Sadao agreed. I would not think of doing anything else. So Hannah said to Sadao that, Okay, we will say to servants that we are going to hand him over to the police. And he is a prisoner of war. And certainly, the position of Dr. Sadao would be in danger if he does not hand him over to the police. Thus agreed together that they lifted the man. He was very light, like a fowl. Fowl means chicken that had been half starved for a long time until it is only feathers and skeleton. So his arms hanging, they carried him up to the steps and into the side door of the house. This door opened into a passage, and down the passage they carried the man towards an empty bedroom. It had been the bedroom of Sadao's father, and since his death it had not been used. They laid the man on the deeply matted floor. Everything there had been Japanese to please the old man, who would never in his own home sit on a chair or sleep in a foreign bed. Hannah went to the wall, cupboards, and slid back a door and took out a soft quilt. She hesitated. The quilt was covered with flowered silk and the lining was pure white silk. So at last they decided that they will carry the man to their house. And when talked about the reaction of servants, Hannah suggested that they must tell the servants that they intended to give him to the police. He said that they must do so, otherwise they would be in danger. So both of them lifted the man, that is the soldier, prisoner of war. He was very light. They carried him to the steps and into the side door of the passage. They carried him to an empty bedroom. Since the man was quite dirty, Sadao suggested that he had better be washed. He is so dirty, she murmured in distress. Yes, he has better be washed, Sadao agreed. If he will fetch hot water, I will wash him. So they took him to the room of Sadao's father. Actually, that room had not been used for a long time, so they carried him there. But Sadao said that man is very dirty. So Sadao said, if you will bring hot water, I will wash him. I cannot bear for you to touch him, she said. We shall have to tell the servants, so he is here. I will tell Yumi now. You can leave the children for a few minutes and she can wash him. Sadao considered a moment. Let it be so, he agreed. You tell Yumi and I'll tell the others. But the utter pallor of the man's unconscious face moved him first to stoop and feel his pulse. It was faint, but it was there. He put his hands against the man's cold breast. The heart was yet alive. He will die unless he is operated on, Sadao said, considering. The question is whether he will not die anyway. So Sadao wanted to clear or wash the man, but Yumi suggested that they should call. Hannah suggested that they should call Yumi, the servant. But then Sadao got busy in checking the pulse of the patient, and he said that if he is not operated, he is going to die. Hannah crowded in fear. Don't try to save him. If he should live. What if he should die? Sadao replied. So Hannah cried, don't let this person live. Actually, they were afraid also. What will happen of their nationalism? What will happen of their love toward this country? Children, that's all in this part of video. Next, we will continue the video in other part of the video.